there will be ample time for questions with Tony, and there is just two things to understand, which is we are at a time right now, for people just getting on, this is Gerald Petchenuk in Los Angeles. This is the weekly conference call that we've had for the West Coast and the Midwest. And tonight it's literally a John Quincy Adams transcontinental conference call because we have Tony Chaitkin on the line from Virginia from the East Coast. And we are in a situation where these concepts that Tony is going to be going over tonight literally represent the life or death questions for the future of the Republic. As you know, Mr. LaRouche has had a webcast every Friday from 5 weeks before the election of November 2012, continuing every week. There's been about 10 or 11 of them now. And the beautiful, brilliant thing about LaRouche's webcasts is that he's able to give you a forecast. He's able to give you a insight that is able to give people an understanding of what flanks of our enemies, the British oligarchy, the globalist financial oligarchy, what flanks are open, are vulnerable, can be moved to move the situation for humanity as a whole forward. And one of the things that our guest tonight, Tony Chaitkin, pointed out in a recent video he did, some of you may have seen it, he'll talk about it a little more, is that a lot of what the oligarchy does is not all that secret and covered up. Like, take the Kennedy assassination case. It's more like, hey, we did it. What are you going to do about it? It's in your face. It's not something that, you know, is, you got to knock on 3 secret doors and say 4 secret passwords to find out. It's an open conspiracy, and being able to understand the flanks that are available because of Mr. LaRouche's deep understanding of the principles of creativity as applied to physical economy, which is something that has been known historically as the American system. And so one of the things that Tony Chaitkin is going to do tonight is make sure, given that Congress and the institutions in the military, intelligence, and other people are looking to LaRouche, are looking to us to provide the leadership to get Obama's rear end removed before this country ends up, in hyperinflationary austerity collapse and thermonuclear war. In order to be able to do that, in order to be able to understand this, you, as a leader of the LaRouche Political Action Committee, as activists, as citizens, you really have to know what the British Empire is, where it comes from, what its underlying axiomatics. Remember, we've discussed the issue of popular opinion, how most people have false ideas which they believe are true. Popular opinion. And the false axioms of popular opinion based on what your sense perception tells you your fellow citizens believe, because that's what's on TV, that's what's in the papers, that's what's taught in the schools. So when these false axioms become the dominant factor, civilizations like this country go to hell. So Tony is here tonight to give you insight so that you absolutely know in your soul, in your spirit, what is America really, and why the British Empire, in the form of people like Tony Blair today, Bertrand Russell, people like this, have such a hatred and such a willingness to destroy and use pawns like Obama, in that. So I wanted to make that clear, as a starting point, that we are out for total victory, and that Tony Chaitkin, who I'll introduce right now and who'll start in a minute, I've known Tony since 1973 when he ran for mayor of New York City. He may not even remember it, but I remember it. And Tony's...
Noah.
You remember
I remember Noah. That was before.
Okay, it was even Tony's memory with LaRouche goes even back further than mine. But one of the other highlights, people may not know, but Tony Chaitkin was an integral part of the candidates movement of LaRouche, political action in the 1980s, specifically in Illinois in 1986, where you can ask him, he'll tell you about it. We actually took over the Federal Reserve building of Chicago for 1.5 hours on March 17th, 1986, with a bullhorn inside the Federal Reserve to drive the treason out. And we also had some activities around what is now Obama's home treason, University of Chicago, the British Fabian fascist behaviorist University of Chicago, where we had some very active demonstrations and distributions which made a very strong impact, to which the oligarchy does not forget, because when you pull the covers off and you expose them to the light of day, they fear LaRouche. They fear our movement beyond our numbers, and that is precisely because of the ideas. So that's all I wanted to say, just so you know. Tony is not just like your armchair, Fox couch potato, throwing out slogans and, trying to out-slogan the last slogan, but actually is totally rooted in depth in American history. And what we discussed is he's going to go over his new research, which is going to be available on the LaRouche PAC website, on FDR and John F. Kennedy and the British hatred of them. And that'll be the first part. Then you'll be able to ask questions and keep your questions on what he brings up. We don't want to discuss, conspiracies of left-handed monsters who came out of an alien planet. We're not discussing if there's any truth in that. We're discussing the revolution of the American system against the British. That's the first part. Then we'll have questions and answers. And then Tony also has some very insightful material on Abraham Lincoln, which is very important also. So we'll have Tony Chaitkin, we'll have questions and answers, and if you do want to ask a question, you got to unmute your phone with *1, and then just announce who you are, and we'll take one question at a time, and we'll try to do that for as long as Tony holds up, and then we'll have the second part on Lincoln and some questions on that. So that is what I wanted to say by way of introduction. So, Tony, are you there?
Yeah, here I am. Thanks, Gerald. Everybody got their sweaters on? I guess
it's snowing out east?
No, it's cold, but not like Wisconsin.
Okay.
So oh, go ahead.
Go ahead. I was just going to say it's about 60 degrees here in L.A., so we're suffering. But
I just have been getting out some videos of a presentation that I did November 18th at the LPAC studios, and it's the paradigm, the American paradigm needed for survival, who we were before the British coup. And this it's on the Schiller Institute website now. You can listen to that if you have a computer, or if you want. If you don't have that equipment, we can send you a DVD of this. I went into new archival findings on the foreign policy of Franklin Roosevelt and the revival of that by John Kennedy, and then the British coup against Franklin Roosevelt and the assassination of Kennedy. The issue, to put it most bluntly, is that we have to return to their point of view, which is the same outlook on man and the nation as the founders, and building on Hamilton, John Quincy Adams, and Lincoln previously. The two figures of FDR and Kennedy are very popular, especially Kennedy, as you get further away from FDR. But everybody alive today has some kind of identification with John Kennedy. And the astounding thing for people to realize is that public opinion is opposed to the standpoint of these beloved leaders. And insofar as public opinion and the consensus of the evil political party system is completely against what they stood for, even while people profess a love for them, there's an instability in the system. I want to just go through a few points on what is in this presentation. I used newspaper clippings and photographs and a couple of videos from the time to go through this. Franklin Roosevelt, during World War II, at the beginning, before we got into it, 1940-41, had issued with Churchill the Atlantic Charter, which was a pledge by Roosevelt, which Churchill signed on to, saying that the aims of the United States and the Allies in World War II were to bring self-government to the world and to raise the living standards of the world's people. This was directly and officially denounced by Churchill a year later, in 1942, where he said, "I'm not here to give up the British Empire. The Atlantic Charter doesn't apply to Britain." But this was a shock and actually kind of an alert that the American President Roosevelt, who had already distinguished himself in fighting the Depression, was issuing this as the war aim. And this spurred directly the anti-colonial movements that spread through Africa, South America, Asia, and really lit up the world with hope. And this was the standard then for Franklin Roosevelt and his closest associates, people like Sumner Welles in the State Department, a guy named Duggan, who ran the Latin American desk. And FDR pursued a policy of active planning, as you've all heard, I'm sure, for after World War II, when we would end the empires, encourage anti-colonial movements, and get industrialization. But he also started those things, particularly the industrialization of South America, during the war and even before the war, because in the late 1930s and the 1940s, when the war was raging in different parts of the world, South America didn't have that war, and he got the industrialization of Brazil started directly. This is a lot of this is based on simply extending the initiative of the building of the dams, hydroelectric projects from the TVA into South America, and then planning to do that in China and other parts of the world. People came from all over the world to confer with us under FDR. Importantly, in 1938, let me just ask, are people online? Can one or two people unmute and say hello so I know I'm talking to some people?
Yeah, Tony, you're loud and clear.
Okay,
we can hear you fine.
Cooper.
Yeah,
This
is
Cooper. I'm
This
online.
is Bob Downton from Portland.
Okay, all right.
Herb
You're coming in
Brown,
loud and
LA,
clear.
California.
All right, let me go. Good. So go back to mute and let me just go through a few
How?
things here.
Yeah,
How do you mean?
just so everyone knows, the phone line is totally filled with there's 55 spots and there's 55 people on. So it's
Great.
totally filled up.
All right. So
How do you mute?
Let me go ahead here. In 1938, Roosevelt's been in office for 5 years. Mexico nationalized the oil companies there. They took over the property of Standard Oil and Britain's Shell Oil and the Eagle Company, which was Lazard Frere. And the American government supported the Mexican government in doing that. And this is very important in world history and in the history that followed, because after the death of FDR, countries like Iran tried to do the same thing and were smashed by the British with the complicity of the Americans. They overthrew the government of Iran in a coup in 1953. The Americans and British jointly to restore the British control of oil and of the nation of Iran. But this was against the explicit, dramatic policy announced by Franklin Roosevelt. So this was treason against the United States. In other words, the actions in the Cold War to suppress nationalism in countries like Iran and elsewhere, which the United States helped the British to do, was directly treason against American policy. And that's not just the policy of Franklin Roosevelt, although it was that was the recent coming out in public of that policy. But this is the time-honored policy of the United States as the leading anti-imperial power in the world. We are anti-imperialism in the world. The communist movement that used those slogans was actually in the era of the Cold War, themselves reaching out for influence from the Soviet Union. But the whole dynamic of the United States versus the Soviet Union versus the communists in the Cold War was a completely fake, unnecessary, tragic setup by the British, which was imposed in the United States by a British takeover of American institutions in the security apparatus and so forth. And I go through this in depth in this presentation. One of the surprises that I got doing this research, which is in the video, and some of this was published in the IR recently, is that President Roosevelt, when he was in Iran for a conference in 1943 with Stalin and Churchill, the Tehran conference, to finish the aims of World War II, he commissioned a report from his friend and representative roving ambassador, General Patrick Hurley. He asked Hurley to draft a memorandum saying how we were going to develop Iran as a model for transforming poor countries throughout the world. And that, I found this memo in the National Archives. It's never been published. And the memo that was written at FDR's request talks about developing transport, communications, industry, sanitation, education in Iran, but that the problem we will have is that the imperialists, the British imperialists, will try to block this. And this is explicit in the memorandum. FDR circulated this with his own cover letter, talking about the 1% that controls the 99% of the population, and saying he hopes that we can get some honest Americans into Iran to help them. He sent this around the State Department. He also sent it to Britain, to Winston Churchill. This was a secret document that was declassified later. It was secret because it was, the British were our allies in World War II, so we're not going to start a war with Britain during our war with Hitler. But that's the policy. This policy was denounced, and this memorandum was denounced by Dean Acheson and other pro-British traitors inside the State Department while FDR was still alive. And they later became the masterminds of the Truman administration when Truman became president. They worked directly with Winston Churchill. I want to mention the one feature of this video, which I think is important, and that is the fascist character of the group of people in England and the United States who carried out this coup after the death of Roosevelt. And that's mentioned 4 individuals, all of whom are fascists of the most direct, grotesque kind. And these 4 individuals are Winston Churchill, Lord Halifax, John Foster Dulles and his brother Alan, you can look at them as twins, and Averell Harriman. And I go into the fantastic fascist background of all of these people, and they are linked together. And of course, these are the men who established the present political party system in the United States. That's the horror behind the present party system. And fascism is the joint world outlook of this Anglo-American clique. The British coup after World War II is never discussed publicly. Some people do fearfully say that the policy changed after Franklin Roosevelt. In other words, the history is so far, the history that's put on the table for the public in the recent decades is so far from just what's in all the newspapers of the time, and what anybody looking at it, without fear would come up with, that this is a very unstable situation that we can break open. There was a lot of fear in this unnecessary Cold War during the Truman administration. I'll mention one other thing. In 1951, in Iran, Mohammad Mossadegh, a very intelligent Iran patriot, took over the prime ministership there on a program of nationalizing the British oil company. It was the British Petroleum Company, known as Anglo-Iranian Oil Company at the time. And he was then sacked by the Shah of Iran under British pressure. And there was an insurrection in the streets throughout Iran and a general strike, the most massive insurrection, for a country of that size. It was July 20th to 22nd, 1952, to put Mossadegh back into office as prime minister. This shook the world at the time, and the next day, after Mossadegh was restored to being prime minister in Iran, Nasser, Gamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt, took power in Egypt, July 23rd, 1952. The two revolutions are very closely linked. We should have backed them, and we would have under FDR, and we did after the fact with John Kennedy. During the 1950s, John Kennedy came up as a congressman and then a senator, and his entire political identity was that he took the side of the Arabs and the Africans against European colonialism. And his link, for example, with Kwame Nkrumah, president of Ghana, prime minister of Ghana, the founder of Ghana's independence, Kennedy's link to him is completely suppressed to the public today. You go into school books published for children, and they don't mention this at all. They don't mention. They call Nkrumah a failure and a communist and a follower of Marcus Garvey, who was thrown out by the army, rather than the British coup that was in all the newspapers and attempted assassinations. John Kennedy invited Nkrumah. He was the first foreign head of state to visit the White House when Kennedy was president. Kennedy had a war against the British in the Congo, and he fought to keep the Congo as a nation and not let the British split off the mineral-rich province of Katanga. So, like Lincoln, Kennedy was trying to keep these nations whole and not let British-inspired secession break them up. And he actually humiliated the British in the Congo. Martin Luther King made a great speech back in the 50s when Ghana got their independence, King celebrated this the rise of Kwame Nkrumah, and Martin Luther King commented in that speech about the evils of the British Empire. When you see this history, you see that the green agenda is directly racism, and that's really what's at the bottom of it. If you want to get to the real root of the environmentalist disease, it is the racial idea that the up-and-coming portions of mankind have to be exterminated. That's the idea of it, and that's directly expressed in the attack on nuclear power. Why does John Kennedy support the nuclear power for the world? Why does he support having all nuclear power plants by the year 2000, all power plants by the year 2000, every new power plant will be nuclear? Why does he support the breeder? This is Franklin Roosevelt's contribution to the 20th century, isn't it? The invention of nuclear science, the bringing that science into the public use in the Manhattan Project. That's not just to make a bomb. One of the guys whose newspaper articles that I quoted in this video was a New York Times reporter, and his name was William T. Lawrence. And in 1940, he had an article in the New York Times saying, this is under Franklin Roosevelt, he said that nuclear materials like uranium the Earth is full of them. They're millions of times as powerful as other forms of energy, and this is the future of mankind. If you go on Wikipedia and look up this guy, they'll say, and reporter was made the historian of the Manhattan Project by our government. They'll tell you that he only said these things. He only reported this because he was a Jew who was worried about Nazi Germany getting nuclear science. A real slander on the outlook of American optimism going all the way back to the founding of our country, which says we're going to bring mankind into the use of fire, into this fire that can give us tremendous powers. That's the American system. So if you want to get to the heart of the political problem, it's nuclear power. Do you disagree with John Kennedy's views on nuclear power, and why? So I want to explain one other thing here, and this is just about wrap it up. In Algeria, there was a French colony going back to the 19th century. Charles de Gaulle, when he came into office as president in the late 1950s, changed his views about keeping a French empire and told the Arab rebels in Algeria that you can have independence. There was a European white settlers movement connected to the British and to British intelligence that formed what was called the Secret Army Organization, the OAS, and set up murder squads, thousands of murder squads in hit teams to try to overthrow de Gaulle, to try to murder de Gaulle, to try to murder other leaders in Italy. For example, the most important humanist leader in Italy, Mattei, the head of the oil company there, who was a great ally of Kennedy. He was attacked and actually murdered by these hit teams. And John Kennedy knew that the American Central Intelligence Agency, under the control of Allen Dulles, who had been appointed to the CIA by Truman, that Allen Dulles and his people were working with these hit teams from Algeria and who were also based in Spain to try to murder de Gaulle and to assassinate various leaders and on behalf of the imperialists. Kennedy fired Dulles as head of the CIA in his first year of the presidency, and Kennedy leaked to the newspapers the fact that the reason for firing Dulles was that he was helping to sponsor these hit teams. During the period after Kennedy was assassinated, the district attorney in New Orleans, Jim Garrison, prosecuted Clay Shaw from New Orleans, who was part of the CIA support team for those hit teams in Europe. So Kennedy actually went after the Anglo-American backers and sponsors of the hit teams that assassinated him in 1963. And this introduces a whole new take on the Kennedy assassination as a continuation of this long-standing American policy. The opposing policy is not American. There is no American opposition to FDR and Kennedy insofar as they have a foreign policy oriented to a Promethean idea. There's no such thing as an American opposition to that. It's British. And one fascinating part of this is, Kennedy, like FDR, favored Arab nationalism as well as the African nationalism. But just look at the Arab nationalism that both presidents were in favor of, collaborated with, and this got Kennedy killed. And then you have this the Franklin Roosevelt initiative in Iran, which is already the Hurley memorandum that we discovered has already been circulating among Iranians, and it has a certain kind of explosive potential. So we really need to present, and I'm looking for new ways and deeper research on this. We're pursuing this as fast as I can, and with some people helping me, to be able to present to the American public who we were, what is this country, and to really evoke some shame and anger in people determining that they have to get back to this or they're going to die.
Okay. All right. So I want to thank Tony very much for that presentation, and we are open for questions. And I can tell you, I know a few of the people who are on the call tonight already have texted me and made it clear that this history is very much alive in the minds of the people on this call, who some of them have direct relationship to what you were saying through parents, grandparents, stories that they were told, things that they know of what happened to their families who were, part of this real pro-American tradition, this real pro-American science and technological advancement. So if there's anyone who does want to ask a question or comment along those lines, unmute and speak up, and we just got to take one at a time. So
Hello.
If someone has started, okay, go ahead. Who's that?
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yeah, is that Charles?
Yeah, it's Charles from Santa Rosa.
Okay, this is Charles Gabriel up in Santa Rosa, Tony.
Hello.
Right. Okay. I'd like to ask Tony, could he go into some detail, if he thinks it's worthwhile, on the way Eisenhower was suppressed, because he was definitely, against the British operations. Just let him go ahead with that one.
Okay. Eisenhower was remember, he came in
Invalid choice.
the Korean War. That was he was campaigning for when he ran for president in 1952. That was the first of the permanent war situations that we got into. He was surrounded in the Republican Party by the enemy, in particular, famously, the Dulles brothers. But when this coup against Iran was in the works, started under Truman, and then the Dulles team continuing under Eisenhower, with John Foster, now Secretary of State, and Allen, head of CIA, Eisenhower was balking at going ahead with this coup against Mossadegh. And from what I've been told, and we need to get chapter and verse on this, but we have it from good sources that the British threatened Eisenhower with blackmail, that they would, if he didn't go ahead with this coup against Mossadegh in Iran, the British would pull their troops out of Korea and destabilize the whole situation and extend a war scenario indefinitely in Asia. And it was real blackmail. In 1956, when the British, French, and Israelis invaded Egypt to try to overthrow Nasser to grab the Suez Canal, Eisenhower said that the British, they had to get out of there, and the United States would not back this, and threatened to break with the British, and they had to retreat. This made, again, America distinguished in the eyes of the Egyptians and the world. And it's this America that is in the minds of people after the war. People in America course, that's fading here. People all around the world, and the only way that it's really faded is that the people who were part of that America and part of working with that America have died off as they got very old. But this was Eisenhower's point of view. I think that he promoted the Atoms for Peace policy and started that as an extension of a U.S. technical advisory policy throughout the world, but it came into conflict with what the Dulles brothers were doing on foreign policy. So I did not go into Eisenhower at all in this presentation because I wanted to show an unmixed, attack on the British position by people looking to industrialize and lift the living standards of the world, that is Franklin Roosevelt and John Kennedy.
Okay. Are there any other questions for Tony on this question of John F. Kennedy, FDR, and their approach versus the British Empire? And
yes, I have a question. This is Larry Richardson in Glendale. I was wondering.
Okay. Go ahead, Larry. Go ahead, and if anyone else, or if that was Anthony or someone, they'll go next. So go ahead, Larry.
I'm sorry. It was a surprise to me you were saying that Kennedy leaked information about Dulles' involvement in these hit teams after he fired him. Did that resurface before he fired him? So yeah. Was it before the Bay of Pigs or just afterwards?
No, the Bay of Pigs was right away when he came in office. You have to look at this video. In the video I have the newspaper articles of the Times. And so it was in the New York Times and other papers, and they're talking. It's clearly material that the White House put in there. The New York Times doesn't generally talk about the CIA as a reactionary state within a state. That was in the newspaper at the time. When Kennedy what's that?
Did it resurface when Johnson appointed Dulles to the Warren Commission?
No, it didn't resurface because if you look at this, look at what happened with the Kennedy assassination. Kennedy is becoming more and more popular. He's got the civil rights movement coming up supporting him. He's got labor supporting him. He's got these foreign leaders who are revere what he's doing and know that this is the U.S. back in the saddle. So the British are desperate. He's murdered. And Lyndon Johnson appoints Allen Dulles, who had been fired by Kennedy, to go onto the commission to say what that murder was about. And if you look, one interesting thing in all these crises, the crisis in Iran in the 50s, the crisis in Ghana before Nkrumah was overthrown, and the Kennedy assassination and so forth, you see the New York Times and some of these other newspapers, the Washington Post, with intense, violent propaganda that is murderous in its expression. And when you say that this man who is fighting for mankind and is up against the British Empire directly, so in defending mankind, when you say that he was murdered and it wasn't a political murder, that's violence. You're doing violence to the public. It's bullying. And people who go looking for little clues about who might have killed Kennedy and who talk about the mafia and talk about this and that, they're shying away from standing up to the bullies. The bullies are not themselves shy to say who they are. The New York bankers, there's 3 or 4 special banks, that have been long associated with the British Empire, who are in Wall Street, and there's the City of London, and there's a war. So the fact that it's a good question which you're asking. It's sort of, you have the astonishment when you see this stuff. You go back to 1961, when the CIA was in disrepute for doing this fiasco of the invasion of Cuba, and Kennedy sets up a commission to study what's wrong with the CIA, and he puts his brother Bobby on this commission. And then they say that Kennedy is dissatisfied with Dulles and the CIA because they are meeting with and collaborating with the people who are trying to do an insurrection against the French government and murder Charles de Gaulle. And that's in the paper. It's in the New York Times. It's in the Christian Science Monitor. So those papers are available to everybody. You don't have to have some special, pass key. So it's a disgrace to the history profession. It's a disgrace to educators. It's a disgrace to all politicians in the United States that they would not defend the viewpoint of these American patriots who were murdered for this viewpoint. So, anyway.
Thank you for your answer. Very informative. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, is there another question for Tony on... Okay, go ahead. Who's that?
Yeah, this is Scott in Washington.
Okay, in Washington. What was your name again?
My name is Scott.
Okay, Scott, go ahead.
Tony, how in the modern context do we show that the policies of the Obama administration are benefiting oligarchical interests versus American national interests, or any other nation for that matter? That mm-hmm. This long view of history is not something that's embraced by the American people, and they've gotten so dumbed down by television that they don't know context anymore. How do we make it simple for them to see that some of these policies that are coming out of Obama are basically reinforcing British crown or oligarchical interests and not our own national interests for the long haul?
I think it's almost a matter of an attention span. It's an emotional issue.
Yeah.
Because, for example, what was the total that was dished out to bail out financiers? How many trillions was that? Trillions upon trillions. It continues, all right? It's a continuous bailout that's still going on.
Right.
What is the purpose of the United States sending, or allies of the United States like Saudi Arabia and Britain with Obama sponsoring the sending of thousands of fighters and hundreds of thousands of rifles and hand grenades into Syria? What's the purpose of that? Well, the clear purpose, based on simple examination of the record of the last, decade of wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the purpose is to destroy Syria. Who could possibly deny that? Again, it's bullying. There's not really an argument. You're not going to get an argument from somebody saying we're trying to protect the people of Syria. Nobody really believes that.
Right.
So it's really bullying. And if you talk about Iran, what policy would we follow if we were following American interests? And it's very simple to refer to almost any period when America was a successful country, which it is not now. And you say, our interest is in spreading civilization. That's not that complicated a concept in some respects. That involves the outlook of Lincoln in particular, which is raising the value of labor, but bringing about stability instead of constant war, and bringing about a raising in the price and dignity and value of labor. These are American principles. The first American principle is self-government. What does that mean? Are we in favor of self-government? That's what our Declaration of Independence and Constitution is about. Self-government means every country is allowed to govern themselves without outside interference and suppression. It's pretty simple. So why are we having sanctions on Iran and Syria? Why did we have sanctions on Saddam Hussein? What is that about? Why did we have sanctions on Libya? None of these countries is attacking us. You can talk about rich people. You can talk about unfair division of wealth and so forth, but to avoid discussing who has power in the world, you're acting like a 2-year-old. There's not very many people who don't understand that Wall Street and London, as an axis, have power in the world, and they're destroying the world. That's not a hard concept. That's simple.
Okay.
And our side is more difficult. You got to be able to show what we did and to make us a successful country. I'd like to discuss Lincoln.
Yes. Thank you.
Okay, so now we're switching to, people may know there's a so-called Hollywood movie on Lincoln out. Maybe your family, your friends, or yourself have seen it. And I haven't seen it. I've heard various statements about it. But, Tony, maybe you should just go ahead and go through the ideas, which also will be presented on the LaRue Show this Saturday, when Tony and Phil Rubenstein will be interviewed by Harley Schlanger on this. So go ahead, Tony, and then we'll have more questions when you're finished with this part of it.
Okay, so this movie was centered on Lincoln promoting the end of slavery at the tail end of the Civil War, when he pushed through the 13th Amendment outlawing slavery. But it in no way gives you any idea of who Lincoln is. And I think that you have to be able to see the continuity of Lincoln's idea, his passion, with the passion of the founders. Actually, I'd like to recommend a trio of articles that I did, and you can, you get the exact references later, but these are recently in EIR. One is called How Ben Franklin Organized Our Economic Independence. It's about what the purpose of the Constitution was. Second article is Think Like an American, Restore Hamilton's Bank. That's Lincoln versus Hamilton versus Jefferson. And then recently, the American Industrial Revolution that Andrew Jackson sought to destroy. accompanying that is Michael Kirsch's pamphlet that we just put out, How Andrew Jackson Destroyed the United States. There's also an article called The Lincoln Revolution, which I wrote in Fidelio in the spring of 1998. All these things are online. You can get them. But let's look at what is Lincoln. If you want to reduce his point of view on economics to a single point, you'd say he's against cheap labor. How do you increase the value of labor? You have protection of industry, which is through tariffs, price supports in agriculture, things like that. You have an upgrade of industry and of the energy throughput per person. You increase education. He founded the state colleges. And you ensure the independence and the dignity of the citizen by having self-government. And what do we mean by self-government? A nation with the power to defend and improve civilization. Do the people of a nation, a country, have the right to have their own government that promotes their self-interest? Are they allowed to own the government? And that is self-government. Is when the people at large have a government that is out to defend and improve civilization, and particularly defend and increase the high value of labor. It means to have high wages. How do you get high value in an employee? How do you get a high value employee when you pay a lot? Well, you have to have leaps in productivity through mastering new physical principles so that the work is more valuable. And this was done by, among other things, by eliminating impediments to economic progress, such as bringing down the cost of transport, bringing down usury, but also introducing new technologies with the support of the nation so that they're going to be successful, like the railroad, like electricity that came along shortly afterwards under the whole Lincoln Initiative. He spoke directly to the people and said that the Civil War is a people's war to defend that idea about self-government. And during the war, the Civil War, the idea of the country was changed. The idea that the people of America had about what this nation was changed in a fundamental way. From a depressed and sinking public opinion of the 1840s and 50s into an optimistic and powerfully, almost a visionary society. People thinking that they could do anything. That's when you had Jules Verne wrote this thing about going to the moon at the end of the American Civil War, and it's based on the idea that the world now sees the Americans thinking they can do anything. And we had the biggest army in the world, and we had 30 years of peace because we didn't want any wars. We had better things to do. You look at Lincoln, Franklin Roosevelt, and Kennedy. All three of them enhanced the national power. Lincoln and Franklin Roosevelt during the Great Wars that they were in, but those are not wars that they started, like the current, crazy people, Bush and Obama. Lincoln and Kennedy were both assassinated by British-sponsored killer teams. The one that hit Lincoln came out of Canada. That was John Wilkes Booth had went up there to get his money and his instructions. FDR's legacy was overturned by this British coup d'etat. Lincoln had a space program the National Railroad System. And this is based on his work in Illinois when he was about 27 years old. In 1836, Jackson had taken down the Bank of the United States. But Lincoln had lived as a teenager and a young adult through the American nationalists, starting the canals and the railroads and starting the progress. And he was thrilled by the idea of progress. So as a young state legislator in Illinois, he led the group that built the railroads in Illinois with state funds and using credit from the Bank of the United States, and after that trying to get credit in any way they could to build these railroads and canals out there, particularly railroads spanning the place. And if you look at the histories, biographies written even by so-called friends of Lincoln, they all attack this policy of Lincoln's to do these railroads in Illinois. And they say it was a folly, and it led to the bankruptcy of Illinois. Well, wait a minute. If you look at the actual history of Illinois, it's the railroads that caused Illinois centrally to become the great power of the middle of the United States. And Lincoln had this idea from his teenage view of the country, and as a young adult of the American system. This leads to his actions as president to start the American steel industry by bringing in the highest tariffs we'd ever had. He also understood and wrote about the distinction between productive labor and unproductive labor. So that you have the government's obligation to promote productive labor and to dampen or dry out, put it that way, unproductive labor and the use of credit for unproductive purposes. People have these, your populist will say that he's for Andrew Jackson because Jackson was for hard money. And Lincoln, why did Lincoln hate Andrew Jackson? What was that about? Why did he say that was corrupt? Because the hard money, saying that silver and gold should be the only money, is the standpoint of the rich man who is interested in collapsing the economy. And so that he has some gold, and the people who don't have it will be at his mercy. And that's what it's about. And the poor fool who's a populist, who is not a rich man, somehow accommodates himself in his depression to that point of view, instead of saying, well, how did the paper dollar get to be valuable? Well, people like Lincoln and Hamilton before him put the power of the government behind building up productive industry. That made the dollar worth something. That's Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln's, launching scientific agriculture, giving free land to farmers, establishing the agriculture department, promoting farm machinery, cheap tools, recruiting immigrants to increase the population as fast as possible, and having some national control over banking with cheap credit for productive purposes. So this idea of Lincoln, if you put slavery, black slavery, into that outlook as a form of cheap labor, as a form of deliberate degradation, then you have the whole picture. I'll just say one other thing, that John Marshall, the Supreme Court Justice back in the early days of the Republic, commented about the Whiskey Rebellion. You know, these guys out in the frontier of Pennsylvania who didn't want to pay taxes on their whiskey. He said that these people were the ones who were always involved in attacks against American Indians. And I think that's a very important insight. You see this same combination of points of view in Andrew Jackson, the famous murderer and mass killer of Indians, and a man who says that we're going to not allow government to get in the way of the private power of people with gold. And who are those people? They are Wall Street, the British, and the Southern slave owners. And so if you fit the idea of race into the scheme of imperialism as a way of degrading and dividing mankind instead of the nation, what does a nationalist like Lincoln think about other nations? Well, nationalism is the proud and passionate support of self-government for us and for other people. That's nationalism. And self-government means industrialization, increasing the powers of the people in each country to subdue nature and be truly independent. That's Lincoln's point of view. You don't get it in that movie.
Okay. So thanks very much, Tony. Now, we do have time for more questions and discussions, and I actually did want to, I don't know if she got on or not, but one of our younger members who's up in enemy territory there in Canada, I don't know if she got on or not, but Avneet, she recently gave a class about the Tony Blair doctrine. Okay. Avneet, can you say a few words about your class about Tony Blair and the liberal imperialists of today that we're dealing with Obama? Because this is, the same history, I think.
It's very important. We had a major town hall meeting in Montreal about a week ago where we had about 15 contacts through a 3-hour presentation going through, and what was discussed was the strategic situation in the world right now, and especially from the standpoint of understanding Tony Blair as the direct British connection. If you want to understand, for naive people who often miss how is Obama a British puppet? Well, all his policies ever since he got in office have resonated with the British policies, with Tony Blair's policies, especially of liberal imperialism, of Tony Blair when he took office, of reviving the Liberal Party's policy of Lord Palmerston or Lord Shelburne, these two leaders of the Britain who oversaw the Irish famines, the Irish potato famines, the famines in India, and Tony Blair is their devout disciple. So this is who we have, and this is very important for Canadians to see also. So, but the discussion tonight was very helpful also. Thanks a lot, Tony.
Sure.
Okay. Any other comments or questions? The floor is open. Just identify who you are and one person at a time. And
Gerald.
Okay, go ahead. Is that Jim?
Yeah, Jim.
Jim
in St. Paul. Yeah.
Okay, go ahead, Jim.
Tony, on Martin Luther King.
Yeah.
You mentioned he made a speech against the British. Is that speech somewhere in your video, or can we find that someplace?
No. He made a sermon in a church. I think it was 1957, and you can get this. I'm sure you can get the words of it, text of it online. It's about the founding of a new nation, Ghana, and he went over to Ghana to participate in the ceremonies around the independence of that country. The first country to have a black president, prime minister, and independence in Africa. And King came back and spoke in that speech about what Nkrumah was trying to do and how important this was, this anti-colonial victory. And then he talked about going himself to England and looking at the palace and Westminster Abbey and so forth. And he talks in a very direct way about British imperialism. I think it's important. I would also want to point out a couple other things about King. That he was an advocate for the industrialization of the South, contrary to, some others who came after him, like the black nationalists that were promoted by the Ford Foundation. He was a defender of the poor in general. And then in his last days before his assassination, he came out against the Vietnam War and was attacking this American adherence to this imperial doctrine, which goes away from the mission of the United States. There was actually an editorial in the Washington Post a few days before he was assassinated that attacked him for daring to speak out against the Vietnam War and saying that he has outlived his usefulness.
Taken out by the British, obviously.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, floor is open. Any other comments, questions?
Gerald?
Yes, go ahead. Is that Dean?
Yeah, this is Dean in Chicago. First, I'd like to say, hi, Charles Gabriel. I haven't seen you in about 35 years. Mainly what I wanted to say was, Gerald, do you remember you had me download and make a DVD out of Tony's presentation?
I sure do.
Yes, so if people can't find it, the Chicago office has a copy of it, and they can run some copies off for you.
Oh, that's great.
Sure.
It's going to be up on the LPAC website, I hope, within a few days. They have to go through a lot of legal stuff to make sure about that we don't get sued for copyright infringement. And you know that some of these outlets would love to sue us for political reasons. So we have to be very, very careful because the Political Action Committee is it's an officially registered federal, committee, and so we have to just watch out. So, but it should be up there within a few days. But it's good to get that DVD if you can. I'd like to get a lot of feedback.
Okay. Any other questions?
Yeah. Sandy.
Okay, Sandy,
hello?
you still in Omaha, or are you back in Big Bear, California?
No, I went to Colorado and I'm back in Omaha.
Okay.
So, I'll share with you. You might want to write this down. You go back to Why the Dumbing Down, and that was John Dewey, but it was also done with the newspapers. And if you will go to the Congressional Record of the House, February 9th, 1917, pages 2946, 2947, 2948, and 2949, you will find out why we're in this mess with the press. And I tried to get this out in the 90s when I found it, and nobody listened, but I think everybody now knows that the press is being manipulated, probably 95% of our news. Now, the JFK, the Bay of Pigs, the guy he fired, because he didn't even know about it even when he was inaugurated. He found out that it was a CIA operation. And the guy he fired was the brother of the Dallas mayor. And JFK was against the Vietnam War, but on the day he was assassinated was the day the money the U.S. currency of over $4 billion was released. I happened to have some of it. I was in LA at the time, and that was reversed. That was Executive Order 11110 was reversed, the second thing that Johnson did after he put his hand on the Bible.
You talking about silver certificates?
Well, they were, the silver, but he was flooding the fiat money with the silver, and he was killed for that, and Bobby was killed later. I had a friend, an NBC reporter there, or actually he was bigger than a reporter, and he said there were a lot of shots. He counted 18. And so they were murdered for that, but around JFK the first year, 32 people were murdered, and that included...
Well, let me ask you a question. Can I ask you a question?
Yeah. Sure.
What do you think about John Kennedy's passionate support for nuclear power? He financed a nuclear reactor for Vietnam just before he was assassinated. What do you think about his support for nuclear power? Are you friends for nuclear power?
Well, let me tell you, it's there, so I know quite a lot about it because I was involved in some things, and I will tell you this, if everybody has a power station, it can be converted to weapons, but if everybody has a power station, that pretty much is like everybody has guns, and nobody's going to really get too busy with shooting somebody if everybody else has the same possibility of protecting themselves. So
I didn't follow you. Does that mean you're in favor of nuclear power?
Oh, yeah. If everybody has it, it's just like guns. Everybody has them. You're not going to have people running around and shooting. If a few people have them, then you imperialism. Nuclear power is good if it's used right. Mm-hmm. But it also can be changed into other things, but that's good, too, because all the nations, because we're going back to sovereignty. Lincoln was killed for the greenbacks as well as he also did something that was brilliant. He gave every other section of land to the railroad so they were able to finance themselves after the thing he did in Illinois. And that was brilliant because that got us going as a nation, and that started the industrialization. So it all goes back to the money guys. Whoever, I think it was Tony that was saying, Wall Street, well, we'll call it what it is. The J.P. Morgan, that's in that congressional thing. And it's the Rothschilds, and it's the Wall Street.
Okay, is there any follow-up questions? Maybe time for a couple more. Is that Anthony?
Hello?
Anthony, go ahead, Anthony. Is that you down there in Lake Arrowhead?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Anthony.
I don't want to make a huge issue out of this, but this does bring out something where I actually disagree with generally the LaRouche group, which is on nuclear power. Okay, I'm one. I mean, I'm not going to say I'm against it exactly, but what I believe, based on what I've seen, is that it's got a lot of problems. Okay, it's dangerous, very dangerous. Not only because it can be made into a nuclear weapon, but because I believe that, disposal of radioactive waste and the possibility of just producing energy safely using nuclear fission seems to me, I personally don't think the scientific problems are solved. That does not mean that the general LaRouche principle is wrong. However, I just have doubts about nuclear fission. I think maybe the next step, nuclear fusion, it is very possible. The other place I kind of disagree with the LaRouche group about is I kind of don't see why solar energy, for example, and maybe other things, but especially solar energy, isn't, also the way of the future. That isn't why can't, let's say we have a project, I've seen it, proposed, I don't know about the practicality of it, but that you could power the entire Earth with solar power, if you had, the whatever power stations that were gathering solar energy, properly placed in orbit, that kind of thing. And the thing I like about it is that it seems like it's a natural source of energy. If you could farm it, condense it through a heavy industrial process, you could power the Earth and in ways that would be just safer. That's kind of what I see. So I'm not a big fan of nuclear power. I just wanted to put that in.
Okay, I'm glad you came out and said that. I was hoping that somebody would say that. So here's my request, and that is that everyone, whether you agree with Lyndon LaRouche and John Kennedy, or you are afraid of nuclear power, everybody should try to insist that the question of energy, whether it should be powerful energy or passive, whether it's having a lot of energy in a small, compact form, or a little bit of energy at a time, in a very diluted form, that is an intensely political question, and that this is understood in that way by leaders like Jack Kennedy and Dwight Eisenhower and Franklin Roosevelt, not by Harry Truman. Harry Truman stated to Dean Acheson that although he used the atomic bomb against Japan, Truman said that the peaceful use of nuclear energy is a bad idea because it would reduce the necessary labor time to accomplish things. Workers would become so productive using it that they would have a lot of time on their hands and they would get into mischief. So that's his point of view, but you have to try to think through why people like Franklin Roosevelt with the Manhattan Project, and of course he wanted the peaceful use of nuclear power, and then Eisenhower with his Atoms for Peace, and John Kennedy with the report in 1962 from Glenn Seaborg, the man he appointed head of the Atomic Energy Commission. These leaders saw the use of nuclear power, which is, of course, hundreds or thousands of times as powerful and efficient as coal or oil or wood. Why they wanted to use this as a means to speed up the rescuing of humanity from poverty, and why the British and imperialists were so frantic to try to stop this kind of technology from getting into the hands of the poor nations of the world. Why? This is a political issue, and it's the oldest issue facing mankind. Should humanity be allowed and be encouraged to get great powers over nature, or is that too dangerous? Why is it considered dangerous?
It can be dangerous, obviously.
But why do you think that Roosevelt and Eisenhower and Kennedy were for this, and foundations in New York and Britain and the royal family of England, for example, are opposed to this? Why? Is there a political issue involved?
Well, there may be, but that doesn't mean I've got to think that, now 40 or 50 years later, knowing all that we know, being aware of the...
What do we know? What do we know differently? What do we know differently?
We know that nuclear energy is dangerous. We know that Fukushima just about, irradiated half of Japan and so on. We know that it's difficult to control this stuff. Now, maybe it's possible. I'm not against it. And like I say, I'm just thinking that, that is at least only one of many avenues for, increasing power and energy and the productivity of labor. But I wouldn't get too fixated on it. At least I wouldn't.
But you wouldn't bomb countries to try to get it, right?
What?
Would you bomb countries that try to get it?
Well, hell no, of course not. No,
okay,
no.
Well, that's good.
I don't know now why the British Empire, let's say, would. Maybe everything you say is true, but that doesn't mean that. Therefore, I should think that at this point we should put a lot of our, energy and research making nuclear power plants.
One of the points that I have in this video is the great project during the time of Kennedy was to make a nuclear rocket to propel spaceships to Mars.
Yeah.
And this project was called the Rover Project. We had a special base in the desert. And I show on the screen during this presentation Kennedy and his head of the Atomic Energy Commission, Glenn Seaborg, in a car at that base. And the idea of the nuclear rocket is that it is powerful enough and compact enough in terms of fuel to be able to constantly accelerate without having too much weight.
Right. I understand.
So that you could actually get to Mars using this kind of power. So nuclear energy. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. I would regard that, may I just say, as a very valid use of nuclear power. Okay, that's great. I'm just wondering about whether the ability to let's say power heavy industry planet wide. That I've got some doubts about whether that is the direction we ought to go. There are other ways of getting energy, maybe safer.
Well, supposing that you're in India, and with solar energy you could power 1% of your industrial needs, and with nuclear power you could power 100%. Which would you choose?
Oh, I'd definitely choose nuclear energy if that was the choice, for sure.
Well, that's why they're choosing nuclear energy in India.
Yeah, well, sure. No, well, maybe so. I don't know. I'm not a. I just would like to. I'm all for a safe. I know the more energy we have that we can use, the better it is. The more productive labor is, and so on. I'm just not sure whether nuclear fission, specifically, power from nuclear fission, from uranium and plutonium fission, whether that's the best way to go. That's my only question.
Okay. Well, at this point in time, I'm going to call a timeout. I had mentioned to Tony, because it is he is on the East Coast, and it is after 12:30 that this was going to be the absolute limit. So I'm sure Tony will be available in the future to get on these calls. Of course, he will be on the Roosh Pack website. If you cannot get the video there, you can call me or any of the organizers that you are in touch with, and we will get you a video of this dynamite historical material. And like I say,
my email address.
Does someone want to give an email address who can make copies of it? Is that what I heard?
I want to give people my email address so they can get in touch with me.
Okay, yeah, go ahead, Tony. Sure.
It's my last name, Chaitkin, Chaitkin, Chaitkin @verizon.net.
Okay, so if you want any materials or you got some historical stuff that, like I say, I know one of the people sent me a text message of documentation from one of the leaders of Iran that Tony mentioned during the presentation, having some correspondence thereof. And, of course, now tomorrow Lyndon LaRouche will be coming on with his Friday forecasts, and you can get that on the website, and you can also get it on the phone line. The same first number, 703-297-8302. But the code for the webcast of LaRouche, which is 8 o'clock East Coast, 7 o'clock Midwest, 5 o'clock Pacific time tomorrow, Friday, the code for that is 93992 if you want to listen to it on the phone line live, or you can get it on LaRouchePack.com. And like I say, we are committed to victory in terms of throwing Obama out, throwing all these British agents who have spread bullshit. And, when Obama opens his mouth, how do you know Obama's lying? Very simple. His lips are moving. That's how you know. And certainly this Benghazi story, this Senator McCain, Ayat, Graham have put the question forward, what did Obama know? When did he know it? The so-called Islamic Muslim Brotherhood, Jihad, Al-Qaeda movements are sponsored by the British and the Saudi royalties to create this chaos and war around the world to prevent this kind of economic development that is characterized by what Tony laid out tonight. So that fight is alive and today, and to the extent that you love American history and you love what this country has been, will be, and shall be in the future, then we can muster the courage and the resources to look these Satanists in the eye and tell them, scat, get out of here, leave, shove off, we don't want you no more. That's what you got to be able to do, is understand this history in depth so that you have the courage and the knowledge to score great victory for the next generations, which is what this is all about. It's for the next generations. It's really in our hands right now because this system is going over the cliff in more ways than just the bullshit that's discussed. So anyway, I'll leave it at that for tonight. Make sure you get a hold of your organizers that you're in touch with, get all the video of Tony, and get on the website for the webcast tomorrow. Okay, so let's call it a night. And I want to thank everyone for participating, and I want to especially thank Tony for, he's not a clock time guy, I can tell you that. He's in the fight all the way to victory.
Okay. Good night.
Okay?
Good
night, everyone. Yeah. Before this country ends up, in hyperinflationary austerity collapse and thermonuclear war. In order to be able to do that, in order to be able to understand this, you, as a leader of the LaRouche Political Action Committee, as activists, as citizens, you really have to know what the British Empire is, where it comes from, what its underlying axiomatics. Remember, we've discussed the issue of popular opinion, how most people have false ideas which they believe are true, popular opinion, and the false axioms of popular opinion based on what your sense perception tells you your fellow citizens believe because that's what's on TV, that's what's in the papers, that's what's taught in the schools. So when these false axioms become the dominant factor, civilizations like this country go to hell. So Tony is here tonight to give you insight so that you absolutely know in your soul, in your spirit, what is America really and why the British Empire in the form of people like Tony Blair today, Bertrand Russell, people like this have such a hatred and such a willingness to destroy and use pawns like Obama, in that. So I wanted to make that clear, as a starting point, that we are out for total victory and that Tony Chaitkin, who I'll introduce right now and who'll start in a minute, I've known Tony since 1973 when he ran for mayor of New York City. He may not even remember it, but I remember it. And Tony's...
Noah.
You remember
I remember Noah. That was before.
Okay, it was even Tony's memory with LaRouche goes even back further than mine. But one of the other highlights, people may not know, but Tony Chaitkin was an integral part of the candidates movement of LaRouche Political Action in the 1980s, specifically in Illinois in 1986, where you can ask him, he'll tell you about it. We actually took over the Federal Reserve building of Chicago for 1.5 hours on March 17th, 1986, with a bullhorn inside the Federal Reserve to drive the treason out. And we also had some activities around what is now Obama's home, Treason University of Chicago, the British Fabian fascist behaviorist University of Chicago, where we had some very active demonstrations and distributions,
and the revival of that by John Kennedy, and then the British coup against Franklin Roosevelt and the assassination of Kennedy. The issue, to put it most bluntly, is that we have to return to their point of view, which is the same outlook on man and the nation as the founders, and building on Hamilton, John Quincy Adams, and Lincoln previously. The two figures of FDR and Kennedy are very popular, especially Kennedy, as you get further away from FDR. But everybody alive today has some kind of identification with John Kennedy. And the astounding thing for people to realize is that public opinion is opposed to the standpoint of these beloved leaders. And insofar as public opinion and the consensus of the evil political party system is completely against what they stood for, even while people profess a love for them, there's an instability in the system. I want to just go through a few points on what is in this presentation. I used newspaper clippings and photographs and a couple of videos from the time to go through this. Franklin Roosevelt, during World War II, at the before we got into it, 1940-41, had issued with Churchill the Atlantic Charter, which was a pledge by Roosevelt, which Churchill signed on to, saying that the aims of the United States and the Allies in World War II were to bring self-government to the world and to raise the living standards of the world's people. This was directly and officially denounced by Churchill a year later, in 1942, where he said, "I'm not here to give up the British Empire. The Atlantic Charter doesn't apply to Britain." But this was a shock and actually kind of an alert that the American President Roosevelt, who had already distinguished himself in fighting the Depression, was issuing this as the war aim. And this spurred directly the anti-colonial movements that spread through Africa, South America, Asia, and really lit up the world with hope.
There will be ample time for questions with Tony, and there is just two things to understand, which is we are at a time right now, for people just getting on, this is Gerald Petchenuk in Los Angeles. This is the weekly conference call that we've had for the West Coast and the Midwest. And tonight it's It's literally a John Quincy Adams transcontinental conference call because we have Tony Chaitkin on the line from Virginia from the East Coast. And we are in a situation where these concepts that Tony is going to be going over tonight literally represent the life or death questions for the future of the Republic. As you know, Mr. LaRouche has had a webcast every Friday from 5 weeks before the election of November 2012, continuing every week. There's been about 10 or 11 of them now. And the beautiful, brilliant thing about LaRouche's webcasts is that he's able to give you a forecast. He's able to give you a insight that is able to give people an understanding of what flanks of our enemies, the British oligarchy, the globalist financial oligarchy, what flanks are open, are vulnerable, can be moved to move the situation for humanity as a whole forward. And one of the things that our guest tonight, Tony Chaitkin, pointed out in a recent video he did, some of you may have seen it, he'll talk about it a little more, is that a lot of what the oligarchy does is not all that secret and covered up. Like, take the Kennedy assassination case. It's more like, hey, we did it. What are you going to do about it? It's in your face. It's not something that, you know, is, you got to knock on 3 secret doors and say 4 secret passwords to find out. It's an open conspiracy, and being able to understand the flanks that are available because of Mr. LaRouche's deep understanding of the principles of creativity as applied to physical economy, which is something that has been known historically as the American system. And so one of the things that Tony Chaitkin is going to do tonight is make sure, given that Congress and the institutions in the military, intelligence, and other people are looking to LaRouche, are looking to us to provide the leadership to get Obama's rear end removed, made a very strong impact to which the oligarchy does not forget, because when you pull the covers off and you expose them to the light of day, they fear LaRouche. They fear our movement beyond our numbers, and that is precisely because of the ideas. So that's all I wanted to say, just so you know. Tony is not just like your armchair, Fox couch potato, throwing out slogans and, trying to out-slogan the last slogan, but actually is totally rooted in depth in American history. And what we discussed is he's going to go over his new research, which is going to be available on the LaRouche PAC website, on FDR and John F. Kennedy and the British hatred of them. And that'll be the first part. Then you'll be able to ask questions and keep your questions on what he brings up. We don't want to discuss, conspiracies of left-handed monsters who came out of an alien planet. We're not discussing if there's any truth in that. We're discussing the revolution of the American system against the British. That's the first part. Then we'll have questions and answers. And then Tony also has some very insightful material on Abraham Lincoln, which is very important also. So we'll have Tony Chaitkin, we'll have questions and answers, and if you do want to ask a question, you got to unmute your phone with *1, and then just announce who you are, and we'll take one question at a time, and we'll try to do that for as long as Tony holds up, and then we'll have the second part on Lincoln and some questions on that. So that is what I wanted to say by way of introduction. So, Tony, are you there?
Yeah, here I am. Thanks, Gerald. Everybody got
Okay.
their sweaters on? I guess
It's snowing out east?
No, it's cold, but not like Wisconsin.
Okay.
So oh, go ahead.
Go ahead. I was just going to say it's about 60 degrees here in L.A., so we're suffering. But
I just have been getting out some videos of a presentation that I did November 18th at the LPAC studios, and it's the American paradigm needed for survival, who we were before the British coup. And this it's on the Schiller Institute website now. You can listen to that if you have a computer, or if you want. If you don't have that equipment, we can send you a DVD of this. I went into new archival findings on the foreign policy of Franklin Roosevelt, and this was the standard then for Franklin Roosevelt and his closest associates, people like Sumner Wells in the State Department, a guy named Duggan who ran the Latin American desk, and FDR pursued a policy of active planning, as you've all heard, I'm sure, for after World War II, when we would end the empires, encourage anti-colonial movements, and get industrialization. But he also started those things, particularly the industrialization of South America, during the war, and even before the war, because in the late 1930s and the 1940s, when the war was raging in different parts of the world, South America didn't have that war, and he got the industrialization of Brazil started directly. This is a lot of this is based on simply extending the initiative of the building of the dams, hydroelectric projects from the TVA into South America, and then planning to do that in China and other parts of the world. People came from all over the world to confer with us under FDR. Importantly, in 1938, let me just ask, are people online? Can one or two people unmute and say hello so I know I'm talking to some people?
Yeah, Tony, you're loud and clear.
Okay,
we can hear you fine.
Cooper.
This is
Yes.
Cooper. I'm
This
online.
is Bob Downton from Portland.
Okay, all
Yep.
right.
Kurt
You're
Brown
coming in
of
loud and
LA,
clear.
California.
All right, let me go. Good. So go back to mute and let me just go through a few
How?
things here.
Yeah,
How do you mean?
just so everyone knows, the phone line is totally filled with there's 55 spots and there's 55 people on. So it's
Great.
totally filled up.
All right. So
How do you mute?
Let me go ahead here. In 1938, Roosevelt's been in office for 5 years. Mexico nationalized the oil companies there. They took over the property of Standard Oil and Britain's Shell Oil and the Eagle Company, which was Lazard Frere. And the American government supported the Mexican government in doing that. And this is very important in world history and in the history that followed, because after the death of FDR, countries like Iran tried to do the same thing and were smashed by the British with the complicity of the Americans. They overthrew the government of Iran in a coup in 1953. The Americans and British jointly to restore the British control of oil and of the nation of Iran. But this was again